Power of Love by AJ Vorman. My parents were divorced when I was a single digit in age. Like most kids in that situation, in that era, I lived with my mother and spent my Saturday afternoon and evening meal with my father. This basically ruined any chance I would be able to have friends because we could never do anything fun together, like go to the movies or play at each other's houses. My father was totally blind due to an accident he'd had as a kid. He'd gotten a head wound while helping my grandfather with the cattle on their farm. The wound got infected and the infection spread to his eyes. This was near the end of the Great Depression, before World War II or penicillin. So, if we were to get a ride to or from our weekly visitation, it would be my mother driving. And that was not always possible, so we often walked. In a small town, nothing is really far from anything else. Even my school was only a little over a mile away, and it was on the other side of downtown. Because my mother worked, we often walked home after having dinner at some restaurant with my father. Even in winter, when it was dark and the temps were in the single digits. My mother used to complain about my father not getting us a cab. On our way home, my sisters and I would often complain about our lives. It occurred to my sister Darla that if our father was dead, we wouldn't have to spend our Saturdays with him. As avid readers of Agatha Christie novels and Ellery Queen magazine, she and I would talk about how we could murder our father in a way that we wouldn't be caught. Not getting caught was important, you see, because in the stories, people tended to be caught, turned over to the police, and presumably jailed. My other sister would have no part of these discussions. She was younger and didn't seem to appreciate how burdensome these forced visitations were on Darla and I. We talked about different things. Poison was a popular topic, specifically what consumable to put the poison in so that he wouldn't notice. Coffee, which he drank a lot of when we weren't there, or booze, which he drank a lot of when we were. We also discussed leaving him on a train track when a train was coming, except neither of us could see well enough to know which set of tracks the train was actually on. We could also start a fire from a cigarette butt since he was a smoker. During one of these conversations, Darla clapped her hands and said she had the perfect idea. I grew up, of course. I moved away, got married, had kids, and all of those standard things that were expected of me. When my father had business in Columbus, Ohio, where I was living at the time, he would visit and get stuff for my kids. Even so, I was surprised when he called one December evening to get my address so he could send a check for me to buy gifts for the boys. The check never came. I'd forgotten about it until he called in early January to say the post office had returned the letter with the check. He wanted to verify my address, so I gave it to him over the phone. A few days earlier, on New Year's Day, Ann Landers and Dear Abby had both written about how important it is to tell someone you love them because anyone can go at any time. I'd been thinking about that, and I'd actually called my mother-in-law to thank her for the lovely Christmas we'd had with her, my brothers-in-law, and their families. So, after I gave my father my address and thanked him for the check I hadn't yet received, I told him. I said to him, "I love you." He got choked up and then said goodbye, and I patted myself on the back for doing a good deed. The next morning, Darla called to say my father had been found dead in his apartment by a neighbor. He'd been in his underwear and had the phone receiver in his hand. She said it was probable that his heart had failed, as he'd had a pacemaker for several years at this point. She said she was taking care of the arrangements and suggested I call our mother about driving back for the service and the reading of the will. Only then did I remember Darla's plan to kill our father. It was quite simple, really. Tell him you love him and watch him die of a heart attack.